It was a reading program for elementary. We had to add an additional license, so the cost went up a little bit. The other addendums were for support for the schools as listed. We had 2 recruitment incentives, and I know that you all had follow-up information in the superintendent's report on Friday, so if there's any questions that you'd like to pose to Mr. Zediger about those 2, one was housing incentive for aspiring teachers, and the other one was just incentives for hard to fill positions for many things, you know, a sign-on bonus, a relocation bonus, a housing bonus. They get usually just one. I know some get more than one. So I think that's everything that was on our list. So if anybody has any questions, those are the ones we will be voting on tonight.
Okay, so let's go ahead and we do have those action items. So is there a motion and a second to approve item 6A, board policy revisions to 4.120, the operation services, food services? Is there a motion to approve that?
So move. Can we do all of them at once, or do we have to do them separately?
Do them all at once? Is that okay with everybody? All right.
Yeah, so I move that we pass all three,
right,
6A, B, and C.
Okay. Very good. Second from Mr. Rollins. Any questions or discussions about anything on those items, 6A, B, or C? Your mic there. There it goes. Okay.
So on item C, if I'm understanding correctly, students only have to pass 3 classes?
So I don't know, is Dr. Vosberg, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Got that.
Yes. So the IHSA recently passed a state guidance policy around athletic eligibility. In a normal school year, athletic eligibility is determined 2 ways. One, passing 5 classes in your previous semester. And then number 2, continuing to pass 5 classes during your season. Because of the pandemic and what's happened to a lot of students and families, they've decided to, the first criteria of previous semester is pass 3. All the schools in our conference are going to make this change, and we're recommending as well. Once a student is on a team in this semester, that student would have to pass 5, as typically is done, to remain eligible. But we believe, well, in normal times, we believe athletics is an intervention for students. I think it was brought up last night in our DLT meeting about just some anecdotes about giving kids a reason to connect and engage at school. And co-curriculars and athletics are an opportunity for that. So we've always held that belief that we can use athletics to get kids connected to adults, usually teachers in our buildings that are coaches. And certainly believe during a pandemic, with all the circumstances, that we should adhere to what the state is doing, because this is a statewide problem, national problem. We want to get as many kids connected and re-engaged back in the schools as possible.
Dr. Vosberg, this is Mrs. McCulloch. Would you just clarify, did our sports competitions begin last weekend? Was my understanding from what I saw on the news. Is that correct?
I believe some competitions have already started, yes. And
so the ones that already started, since we had not yet voted on this, a student would have to have been passing 5 for last weekend, because we had not changed the policy yet. Is that correct?
That is correct. So students to participate in a athletic IHSA sanctioned competition had to pass 5. They could be on the team practicing, right, but they cannot participate in an IHSA activity if they're not meeting the district policy and the state policy.
So now that if this passes, for next weekend, a student can participate even if they were passing 3 last semester, but the following weekend they would have to show that they're passing 5 during that week. So it's only good for like 1 week.
It's good to get on the team originally. It doesn't exclude a kid from this whole season. If you left it at pass 5, a student that only passed 4, for example, would be ineligible for the whole semester. So by making this modification, they're eligible to participate if they have to continually pass 5 classes each week.
Okay. And I'm just going to say to the board that I was really not in favor of lowering standards, but because they have to continually pass the 5 throughout the semester, the rest of this semester, it just kind of opens the door to let them come in, but we're not lowering the standards for the rest of the semester, basically, I guess is what I'm saying, in my opinion, so I'm going to support it.
And to be clear, this is just for this pandemic. And
that is for this semester only. That's the way it's written in our board regulation. There's no predicting what the IHSA could do next season. I would hope that we're back to a more normal situation, and it's back to a normal situation for the state guidance on athletic eligibility.
Cindy, did you have a follow-up?
I clearly understand, and thank you for giving that clarity. As we prepare our students for college readiness, the modifications do concern me, but I definitely understand given the circumstances. Thank you.
Other comments or discussion? And then call the roll on the approval of the board policy revisions for 6A, 6B, and 6C.
Ms. Pearson?
Yes.
Mr. Rollins? Mr. Scrivano?
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch?
Yes.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Stanford?
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Okay, we'll now move on to the Planning and Development Committee items. Mr. Rollins, any follow-up items from you and your committee?
Or none.
So next is the governance, which is me. And what I wanted to actually have a little discussion about is, I sent those operating guidelines to all the board members and a couple of the administrators or whatever. And the only discussion that I wanted to have or suggestion that came up was there are a couple board members who would prefer to keep it at the 1 year rolling over, not rolling over, but electing or appointing committee chairs every year. One of the points made by Mrs. McCulloch actually was, that we do elections for board officers every year, and it could make 2 of the committees change anyway every year. P is supposed to always chair the planning, and the president is supposed to chair the governance committee or whatever. So, Mr. Siegel, I wanted to ask your input as well on what you thought about, because you were one of the other board members who thought going every year would be a good idea.
I do think 1 year appointments would be ideal, especially in this first year getting started. Just trying to figure things out has been, it's felt a little bit clumsy at times. I think I'll definitely be ready to hand the baton to somebody else after a year and let them run a good deal more smoothly than I have.
You're doing so well. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I want to hear from any other board members on what they think, whether or not, if they have a preference or it doesn't matter to them. Connor.
I would say it doesn't really matter to me, but I understand the logic for doing it yearly.
Okay.
It would be consistent, as was said, about the officers.
Anybody else? Right. Well, it sounds Mr. Rollins. Go ahead.
Ken, this is Jude.
Go ahead, Jude.
You did mention the officer thing. The other piece is there is, as David said, we've all felt clumsy, David. Well, maybe not Tim and Ken, but really learning a lot more about how the whole system is from a communication perspective, from a dissemination of information, and from the way that we are hoping to operate as an organization with, broader, with more specific timelines and holding people culpable to their timelines. So there's a lot to be learned from doing it. I'm happy to do it again if that's the will of the board. I think we need to make a group decision. But I also am very happy to let other people step up and find their way and learn as well.
Mr. Rollins?
I wanted to say it doesn't matter to me either way.
I was thinking, just my comment about it was that it would help keeping it every year. It would help with every board member more quickly getting involved and engaged in the process. So I can understand that. So I think we'll go with the 1 year and try that and see how it goes. And if we want to make an adjustment, we can always make. These are just guidelines anyway. So is all that I have. So we will move on then to our consent items, which include the following: payroll, accounts payable, purchase orders, construction bid request log, the addendum to the District Management Group amendment for Urban Learning and Leadership Center, recurring contract for Learning A to Z, recurring contract for N2Y, which I think is news to you, right? And the recruitment incentives, and housing for aspiring teachers. The consent items from governance then were the meeting minutes of January 26th, the 21-22 academic calendar, the contract purchase orders, the 2 student zone appeals for 10D and E, workers' comp settlement for KH, the workers' compensation settlement for SL, and the freedom of information log. Is there a motion and a second to approve the consent items?
So moved.
Mr. Connor, is there a second?
Okay.
Are there any consent items that board members wish to have pulled for separate consideration?
9E.
I gotta go flip my page back. MG contract? The others? Have the coordinator then call the roll on the consent items not pulled.
Mr. Rollins?
Yes.
Mr. Scrivano?
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch?
Yes.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Stanford?
Yes.
Ms. Pearson?
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
So now I will take a motion and a second to approve item 9E, the addendum for District Management Group.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Connor. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Siegel. Questions, comments, or discussion? Or, no, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Okay. Connor.
Yeah, on this one, so, hang on, let me just, are there other schools that should be a part of this that will be? Where are we at in terms of sort of evaluating a wider spread on this one?
So this is a contract.
This is probably
to-
Dr. Vosberg.
Yeah. So this is a contract to work with learning partners that are selected by the state of Illinois,
Right.
part of Illinois Empower grant money.
Right.
So your question is, will there be other schools that engage?
Right.
Yeah, there will be. These are additional funds that were allocated back in September. Budgeting for this is going on right now for the following year. And so these are schools that received additional money above their original allocation from the state. So they're adding services to these providers. Typically, our goal is to do all that work this spring. We did that last spring.
Right.
And then there are a few schools that, due to fluctuations with the state projections on the grant monies, will have extra money and engage in some of these are addendums to original contract.
Okay. So maybe the tenor of the question is, how are we positioned essentially for next year in terms of the list of the schools. And I was just, kind of looking at this. And I guess this is one of those where, it has the return on investment time, section that talks about, the fact of first time and so forth. So I'm really asking more of maybe a general question is, where are we in this process and how do you anticipate it going forward? Which, is this going to be district-wide? Is it still going to be certain schools?
It'll be certain schools based on their status with the state. And so each year the state will identify based on test score data if they qualify for Illinois Power Funds. Obviously with the state halting testing last year, the schools stayed in the same category.
Okay.
We don't know what will happen this year because right now we're planning to take the accountability test in the spring. But we know that if you're reading the news, there's some change in leadership at the federal level in the Department of Education, and there are waivers available. Illinois is expected to apply for some of the waivers, so that all impacts the status of the school, if they're lowest performing or not, and what amount of money they would receive.
So I guess, again, maybe part of the question is, given all the changes, which we're all aware of, is, and we're really heading down the line right now on all the budgeting, is, when might we hear? Would this be a mid-year adjustment that we might expect, or?
Well, right now we're projecting the money for next year, and then it's hard to predict what we'll hear from the state or federal government. What we do try to do with all of our planning is tie it to things that are already happening in the building and use this money to supplement the work to get better at the things we're already trying to do. So schools have learned to be flexible in their planning. We know we need support in professional development, PLC development, social emotional learning, freshmen on track, leadership development. So those are like broad categories. You can look through each contract to get specific, but they do, as they go through the budgeting process, they do kind of lay out their theory of action for their budget, and then use this grant money to help fill in the gaps.
Yeah. I think maybe my last question, I know you can't answer this one, but obviously we've noted before that we anticipate and we know that there are students who are getting further behind with the pandemic, and so I'm assuming that any direction on any programs for that would be over and above something like this. Or maybe I should ask that as a question because I don't know.
Yeah, yes, our priority is getting students back to grade level, and we know that the pandemic has impacted them. So are you asking, does the grant money help us in that regard? Absolutely, it does.
Okay, yes. And so then I would think it would be even more exacerbated for next year because now it's going to be a cumulative year behind for a lot of students.
Yes.
I think this is one I can just speak for myself, is I would really be interested in the results on this one because, when I read through it, one of the questions that did come to mind is something we've said is, what about the remediation for the kids that are really falling behind, especially the remote, which has been noted a lot. So I think that's one on the side. I really think this is one that we're going to need a lot of follow-up, and as changes are made, because I have a feeling, so one of my suggestions would be, if there are things we can do on the planning side that we know, and I'm making this up, but let's say in October of next year, that there's, we'll know more about the changes and where we're at, that's something we bake into the process. It won't be like, oh, all of a sudden it happened. It's like we're doing at least some forethought. So it's probably consistent with what you're doing, but all I'm saying is, let's prepare on this one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We spent all last year preparing the principals and their school improvement teams on strategic budgeting. So that's exactly what you're talking about. Yep.
Any other questions or comments on item 9E? I'll have the coordinator then call the roll on the approval of the addendum for the district management group. Direct microphone. There it goes.
Oh, okay. Mr. Scrivano?
Yes.
Mrs. McCulloch?
Yes.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Stanford?
Yes.
Ms. Pearson?
Yes.
Mr. Rollins?
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
We'll move on to the closed session consent agenda items, which include the appointment of Ronnie Sturm as a 12-month Dean for Health Services, the notice to remedy for Steve Gangler, the HR organizational report addendum, and the closed session consent items, including the one EIA for student 8209. Is there a motion and a second to approve the closed session consent items?
So moved.
Mr. Connors, or a second by Mr. Rollins? Let's call the roll. The approval of the closed session items. We've got to switch seats here, huh?
Mrs. McCulloch?
Yes.
Mr. Siegel?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Stanford?
Yes.
Ms. Pearson?
Yes.
Mr. Rollins?
Yes.
Mr. Scrivano?
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Okay. For board member or action steps, the one that I wrote down was for board members that would be interested in helping Mr. Siegel out on the listening session on March 11th with the next Rockford group. Jump out of your seat and volunteer for that. Okay. Any other action steps that I missed? Mr. Rollins.
This isn't an action step, but it's new business. So we've had this years-long discussion about the tennis courts, and it just showed up in the paper again this weekend. And I'd like to, I guess, ask that we get a report on exactly what's going on with the tennis courts, because I thought this had all been resolved years ago, and it keeps rearing its ugly head.
Okay, Mr. Phillips, you're going to handle that one, or Mrs. Hoadley?
So last year, we were informed by the Rockford Park District that they were walking away from our IGA, where we were sharing maintenance and upkeep on the courts. A year prior to that, if you remember correctly, we had a group of residents that were interested in revitalizing the five older courts to the what I would call the west of the ones that had been renovated during the facilities master plan. We gave the community members a year to try to fundraise. Last February, Ms. Holdy and I met with Coach Woosley. He was the only, it was originally Coach Woosley and the community members that approached us. There was no community members at last February's meeting, but they were not successful at raising money to revitalize those five courts. We then moved forward with demolishing those courts prior to June 30th of last year. Over the summer then, we left the 9 courts open. The public was able to use the courts over the summer, but then we were going to have further discussion on how to proceed from there.
So this is kind of my concern. So we had these discussions years predating you, Mr. Phillips. And this was part of the discussion with the IGA with the Park District. And the consummation of that was an agreement which was approved by the board which was that we would maintain the tennis courts for our students, the schools, and the school use of the schools and our students. The park district would pay the operating costs of the tennis courts for the general public. If the park district has decided they don't want to pay the operating costs, not clear on what we're analyzing or looking at, because we already made this decision probably 5 years ago.
Can I say something?
Go ahead, Mrs. McCullough.
I asked this question and I heard that Auburn, we lock the courts. We don't, we have them at Jefferson but not East, is that correct?
We have tennis courts at all of our high schools.
Okay, so the other 3 high schools, the courts are locked when the students are not using them, is that correct?
That's correct.
So now that we no longer have an agreement with the park district, why would we not follow the same protocol at all 4 high schools?
So I believe that has been a discussion internally that we would follow what we've done. We have a facilities usage agreement that our community members are able to request usage of our facilities as well as our outdoor facilities. It had just been I guess I had not been a part of past discussions, and this had just been an ongoing discussion here whether we would continue to allow Guilford to operate as a community.
I think the only thing we've been contemplating is whether or not we'd leave it unlocked, and we can get that consensus from the board. We, during the fall, left it unlocked as a gesture of goodwill to buy some time and inform the board that we were doing that. But I think if the will of the board is to lock them up after the students are done using it, that's something we can do. We certainly are not contemplating turning the lights on or any major maintenance costs. It's merely allowing community members to use it when our students aren't.
But Dr. Jarrett, there is wear and tear, and so there will be additional cost. And I'm not quite sure why, when I reread that IGA this past week, it said that we only needed to fix 6 courts, and it appears that we've upgraded 9 of them, because I said, well, so I don't know if we want to continue down the road to maintain 9 courts, or when we come to that point again, we'll probably have a whole different board and nobody will even remember this conversation. So, I guess, Mr. Scrivano, do you think that we need to actually bring it to the board for some sort of consensus on a future agenda? Just so we can be done with it?
We'd weigh in, or you can just direct us. Yeah. That's something that this is not our core business. This is not something we're passionate about. And
right.
You have to decide. This is a purely political matter. I think the Park District is hoping that we are going to at least leave it open during the daylight hours, and that wouldn't be a cost they'd have to incur. But at the end of the day, our job is to provide tennis courts for our students. Our job is not to run a tennis center.
And Dr. Jarrett, why would we do something different at one school than the other schools?
I'm not taking a position of advocacy, Board Member McCullough. I am stating the options.
Okay.
So, Rollins, do you want to make a motion now for us to act on this, or do you want it to come back?
We can't make a motion now because it's not on the agenda.
Okay.
I'm just...
Okay. All right, okay. I would agree. I mean, other board members want to speak to it. I mean, I'll just speak to it. I agree. I think that we, are not in the business of providing tennis courts for the community. That's not our core mission. So I kind of agree with that. I think that it's like, I kind of relate it to golf courses, Don't get into the golf course business just because we've got, kids that play golf. Or whatever. Board members? That's okay. Mr. Rollins, you want to?
I just want to say there's a little bit of a governance issue here. I just don't like, we have these conversations, we come to decisions, we enter into an IGA with the Park District, and, a couple of years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, we find out that things aren't being done the way the board approved. And
To be clear, Mr. Rollins, they just changed their mind as a park district this fall, and that's the only time it's deviated from the agreement. This is because they had budget cuts, the rules, they changed their commitment level. We, in good faith, continued through the fall, and if you'd like to stop doing it in the spring, we'd be happy to take direction from the board on that. Really, if you do nothing, I guess the direction is that we lock them.
I think that's what I'm saying, is that you have the direction from the board. I'm not sure what direction you need to look for from the board.
But to be clear, they didn't do their part on the IGA and demolish the courts that they were supposed to demolish anyways. So it's not just the fall. I mean, they were supposed to do that like in 2016, and we finally did it last year. So, anyways.
All right, so, I think you've got, go, Mr. Connor?
Yeah, well, sorry to state the obvious. What's happening is that there was an article by an uninformed columnist in the paper. And for the 20 people that still read the paper, maybe that made a difference. But I think the point is, there's obviously some tacit pressure here. And I'm not sure who this is coming from, but, clearly the individual that wrote the column was uninformed that our mission is not to do, public anything quite like that. We have some facilities that we have opened up to the public, really in support of the community, but really primarily because of our students. And we're all under the same pressures. The Park District has it more. So I totally understand that they're having difficulties. So I'm just going to say out loud that we're walking around the issue that we're getting, some pressure from people who don't have responsibility to do this, which we do. And so if anybody's out there listening, one or two of you, it's like, look, guys, we have limitations on budget like everybody else, and we've made a decision on this. And I love tennis. It's a great sport, but that is not our job. And so I'll just say that. That's why I think in part it's coming up, is it was, publicized. But I think Mr. Phillips said it well. The public had a chance to do some fundraising. If somebody really wants to do this, let them do fundraising and, figure something out. And we have talked about this.
Well, I think clear direction on that. So.
I just again want to reiterate, not 5 years. It was one fall that the Park District didn't do their part. So we will move on in the spring.
Any other action steps or items for tonight's board meeting?
Ken?
Go ahead, Ms.
This
McCullough.
is Mrs. McCullough. We had a conversation in the past about the elementary IBB, and had a little bit of conversation, more conversation about that recently. I'm just wondering if there is a timeline when something will be brought forward. I understand the hesitation on everything with the being overwhelmed with everything that we're dealing with the pandemic. I just was looking for an update as to when administration feels they'll be bringing something forward to the
For
board.
the International Baccalaureate.
We'll add that to our list, and I'll have Mr. Phillips and Dr. Saltis have been doing a great deal of work on possible options, and we'd be happy to bring that forward. We had not brought it forward due to obviously being very focused on pandemic-related issues, but as we start to see hopefully a light at the end of the tunnel here with vaccination occurring, we can certainly put some focus on that.
Absolutely understand that. Just wanted to get it on the list. The other thing is aren't those microphones going to be changed so that Mrs. Fromm doesn't have to switch?
That's coming.
Sooner than later, I hope.
Soon
for her sake.
enough, right? Right, so, right. If there are no further comments or agenda items, I'll take a motion for us to adjourn.
So moved.
By Mr. Connor, is there a second? Somebody seconded? David did, okay. Those in favor say aye. Opposed, same sign. We are adjourned at 7:40. Thank you.